in the Pokemon trailers from a few months ago for Pokemon ZA, we got to learn about a bunch of different mechanics, but we also got to meet a lot of different characters. For example, we now know that AZ will be in the game. Now for me that raises a question, could AZ actually become champion? So of course AZ's main Pokemon is his Floette, meaning that his starter is going to be a Flabébé. But also we do get to see him in the end of Pokemon X and Y, where he has a Torkoal, a Sigilyph, and a Golurk, meaning that he has 4 Pokemon to try and beat Scarlet and Violet and become champion.
So first off, we had to, of course, design the character and name him AZ. And of course, he is given his iconic white hair. Now on the beach, we get to see a mysterious Pokemon that fends off a bunch of smaller, a bit scary Pokemon by screaming really loudly. Wow, okay. Then of course we give him a sandwich, and then he kidnaps us from a cave. And apparently Nemona enjoys that. Now after a bunch of training against lower level Pokemon, Floette was finally ready to be able to get into Mesa Goza, and of course he had to fight Nemona first, and she loses because she is horrible at Pokemon battles, even though she's a champion. I don't know how. And wow, isn't this city absolutely beautiful? See, there is an entire city based around one school. Now as a short intermission, I'm going to be opening some Pokemon cards. Now in this pack we got first a Carablast, a Torchic, a Lilligant, an Alolan Graveler, a Virizion, a Hop's Choice Band, Articuno, Clang, Larvitar, and a Lycanroc. Yeah, this pack was horrendous. Now after doing some Terra raids, I was finally ready to do the first gym challenge where we have to push around olives. And after doing that, it was time for the battle against the bug type gym leader. Now I only had a Flabébé in this battle, which I of course terrestrialized immediately and started to deal damage. Now using Fairy Wind, I was able to do a bunch of damage to the Nimble, in fact one shot with a critical hit, and then using Fairy Wind again, I attacked the Tarantula and it almost died, but I still needed 2 hits to take it out. And of course this battle is a bit more difficult when you only have 2 Pokemon, but then I was up against the Teddiursa, which terrestrialized into a bug type. By using Fairy Wind, I was able to do a bunch of damage to Teddiursa, but a bit less than half, so this would take 3 entire hits. And finally, after the 3rd hit with Fairy Wind, I managed to get the Cortando Gym badge. And this guy wanted to trade my Flabébé for his Snom, and of course I'm not going to accept that. That is a horrible trade. But then I realized something. Sigilyph doesn't exist in this game, meaning that I had to catch another Pokemon. And of course I went for a Bronzor. I asked ChatGPT what Pokemon was closest to a Sigilyph, and it said Bronzor, so that's what I'm going with for this challenge. Now after a bit of training, Flabébé started to evolve, and it turned into a Floette. But of course I'm not going to evolve it any further. I'm not going to evolve it into a Florges because of course AZ had a Floette, not a Florges. But then it was time for my battle against the grass type gym. Of course the weird olive Pokemon lost against my amazing Bronzor, and the Sudowoodo also got absolutely destroyed by, of course, a lot of hits. It took a bunch of hits to do that. But finally I got a grass type gym, and then it was time to challenge Yono. But of course first I had to catch another Pokemon, which was Torkoal. Now after a few hits, Floette was able to take out the Wattrel, and then it was time to switch out into a Torkoal because he absolutely is a tank. Of course the Bellibolt couldn't do anything because of drought. Water types do a lot less damage against Torkoal, and with 2 lava plumes, Bellibolt was gone. Now I did the same thing against her Luxio, which of course died, and then after 2 hits the Mismagius was also taken out, thus allowing me to defeat the electric type gym. Now I did also find Solar Beam, which I then decided to give to Torkoal. Now that was an absolute lifesaver against, of course, Kofu. It didn't one-shot his Veluza, but in 2 hits it was out. And of course, Torkoal's Drought was amazing in this battle, not allowing Kofu to do that much damage. So of course, Torkoal again uses Solar Beam against Wugtrio, and then I used Bronzor for this battle, and did very little damage. But I decided to heal my Torkoal during 1 round, so that I could, of course, then switch out to Torkoal and do tons of damage. Now Crabhammer does do a lot of damage, but because of Drought and Torkoal being an absolute tank, it almost did nothing. Now the Solar Beam took out the Groanable, which means that AZ wins the Cascarrafa gym badge. But after this battle, Bronzor also decided to evolve, and it turned into a Bronzong, which is way tankier and of course way better. So it was finally time to take on the Medali gym, the normal type gym leader, Larry. Now of course I started using Torkoal because Torkoal is an absolute beast, and I decided to terrestrialize it. Now Torkoal, of course being Torkoal, avoided Komala's attack and then used Lava Plume to do tons of damage, but it would take 1 more hit to take out Komala. And then it was time for his Dunsparce, which took a few more hits, but of course with a burn, I managed to do some extra damage to him, but I still need to hit him 1 more time, but I decided to use a Super Potion instead to heal my Pokemon a bit for the next battle. Then it was time to use Lava Plume against the Dunsparce, and the Dunsparce fainted. Now finally it was time for his last Pokemon, his Staraptor. Of course, a really difficult Pokemon to play against, and he terrestrializes into a normal type. Now of course Staraptor is faster, so it does damage to me first. It did a lot of damage, but you know, I survived of course, and I used Lava Plume to see how much damage I could do, and it didn't quite one-shot, so it instead took out my Torkoal in the next turn. But then it was time for Bronzong, which of course with 1 hit took it out. And that way, AZ also won the Medali gym and won against the normal gym type leader. Then I decided to give myself a Golett because it didn't exist in the game unless you had the DLC, and I didn't want to go and do the DLC. Then of course I evolved it into a Golurk and used it against the Ghost type gym leader. And in that battle it absolutely cooked and destroyed everything in its sight. And then it was time for Torkoal to use Flamethrower and take out Mimikyu's Disguise. And afterwards, of course, Golurk managed to one-shot Mimikyu. Now of course, Golurk is also tank, absolutely tanked that attack from her Pokemon, and then my Torkoal managed to do some damage with Flamethrower and one-shot the Toxtricity, thus managing to win the Ghost type gym. Immediately after, I decided to take on the Psychic type gym, and of course Bronzong was amazing for that, using Payback to do chips on Farigiraf. But of course I had to change out to my Floette, which also took out the Farigiraf. And then I switched out to Golurk against the Gardevoir, which using Heavy Slam managed to one-shot. And then was Espathra, which of course did a lot of damage to my Golurk, but that absolute tank survived it, and then did a bunch of damage to Espathra. And finally it went out, only having 8 health before that. But then it was time to switch back into my Floette, which used Moonblast against the Spathra, which of course did a lot of damage, but it needed one more hit afterwards to finally take it out. And then it was Floette against Florges. Of course, my Floette absolutely tanked that, and then using Moonblast, it managed to do a bit of damage. Now, of course, Petal Blizzard finally took it out, so my Floette fainted. But of course I switched into Torkoal, which used Flamethrower on the Florges, which did a bit of damage, but then Florges used Psych against me, which did enough damage to take out the Torkoal. So it was time to switch out to a new Pokemon, and it was Bronzong, the only Pokemon left. They decided to revive Torkoal, however, and of course it did nothing against Bronzong, which made me notice I didn't even need to revive Torkoal. Instead I just needed to heal up my Bronzong so it would be full health, and Florges could basically not do anything against me, since Steel types resist Fairy types. And then just continuously doing damage to the Florges, and even though my special attack fell, it doesn't matter because Gyro Ball is a physical attack, and just by continuing to chip away, Florges finally died. And that means, or died, fainted, and finally I won the Alfornada gym as a Z. And then of course I decided to do some more terror raids to get a bunch of XP candies so that I could level up my Pokemon a bit for the next battle. The reason for this is because in my last playthrough I found the Ice-type gym leader to be really difficult, but that wasn't really the case this time. So I used my Bronzong, of course I used Rock Tomb, one-shot the Frostmoth, which of course was her first Pokemon down, or his first Pokemon down. And then he sent out a Beartic, which of course got chipped by some of those Rock Tombs and finally fainted. Then it was time for Cetitan, which used Liquidation. Of course, my Bronzong tanked that again and used Rock Tomb, but finally it died. So it was time for Golurk that one-shot the Cetitan. Then of course it was time for Grusha's Altaria, which terrestrialized into an Ice type. So Torkoal avoids the attack and then uses Flamethrower. Torkoal just avoids everything apparently. He uses Flamethrower to one-shot Altaria, thus ensuring the win against Grusha and letting us get the gym badge. And now with 8 gym badges, it was finally time to beat the league and become champion. So then after being questioned by the Elite Four Rika, I finally got to go in to the area where I was going to battle the 4 Elite Four. And first off, of course, I had to play against Rika, which has ground type Pokemon. So I use Energy Ball against his Wishcash, which of course one-shots. Then Earthquake against his Camerupt, again one-shot. Rika is pretty easy to defeat actually. Then the Ductrio of course is faster than my Floette, so it uses Sandstorm, but then it gets one-shot by my Floette. And then time for the Domfan that actually doesn't get one-shot by Energy Ball, so it manages to use Iron Head, which doesn't quite kill my Floette, but the Sandstorm that Dugtrio whipped up does kill it. So then it's time for the Golurk, which one-shots with Earthquake, and finally Rika uses his last Pokemon, which is his Clodsire, that he terrestrializes into a ground type. Now Solar Beam does do a bit of damage, but of course Clodsire just uses Protect on and on again, really annoying, and finally takes out my Torkoal, but of course Golurk destroys it. And then it's time for Poppy, which has Steel type Pokemon that are really tanky, but of course my Pokemon are really good against them. And then it's time for Bronzor, that also dies to Flamethrower in one hit, which is just amazing from Torkoal. Then it's time for Corviknight, that also takes a lot of damage and of course gets one shot. Then the Magnezone that doesn't get one shot unfortunately, and therefore does damage to my Torkoal. But my Torkoal uses Flamethrower and takes it out. And finally it's time for her last Pokemon, terrestrializes her Tinkaton and uses an insane move that unfortunately for her is not effective against me. So I use a ground type and do more than half damage, and another earthquake is enough to take her out. And then it was time for Larry, that is now instead of flying type leader instead of a normal type. So of course against this Tropius I one shot with flamethrower. He switched into Bronzong against the Staraptor, which of course it's a psychic type, and I knew that Staraptor would use close combat, so 2 power gems was enough to take it out. And then it was time for Altaria, and of course I used my Floette to terrasilize it, and it uses Moonblast to do a lot of damage, in fact almost enough to take it out, and 1 more hit was enough. But then Revelation Dance, so annoying, took out my Torkoal, but of course my Bronzong did tons of damage to it with Power Gem and finally took it out. Its final Pokemon was Flamigo. I used my Bronzong again, and it managed to do some damage with using Power Gem, which is amazing. But of course 1 more hit would be necessary for it, so Golurk of course uses his Heavy Slam, which finally takes out the Flamigo, meaning there's only 1 person left in the Elite Four, which is of course Hassel. Now for the battle against Hassel, I terrasilized my Floette immediately, because Floette of course is a fairy type and he has dragon type Pokemon. So I use Moonblast against a Noivern, 1 shot. Then I switch into Bronzong against the Drugalgi because it has poison type moves. And of course I use Ice Spinner to do more than half damage, so 1 more Ice Spinner would be enough to take out the Drugalgi completely. Now Haxorus was really difficult. It one-shot my Floette. So what I did was I used Iron Defense on Torkoal tons of times until it did nothing against me. And a few Earth Powers was enough to finally take it out. And therefore he had sent out his next Pokemon, which again with Flamethrower was taken out, and then his last Pokemon used this Glaseado to Baxcalibur, but because of the Iron Defense it does almost nothing. So after a bunch of him doing damage and me doing damage, unfortunately the Torkoal did faint, but then I just had to send out my next Pokemon, my Bronzong, which absolutely almost got destroyed, but used Ice Spinner to finally be able to defeat the Baxcalibur. Now AZ could finally take on the champion. So it was time to go up and meet Jida, the chairwoman of the Pokemon League. So our first Pokemon is of course the Spathra, and I use Golurk here, which uses a ghost type move to do a bunch of damage. Now of course the Spathra misses because I used a move that makes me disappear, and then Phantom Force finally takes it out. And now for Veluza, I use a grass type move using my Floette, and the Veluza uses Liquidation, which does a lot of damage, but still Floette takes out Veluza. And then Moonblast using Floette to do a bunch of damage to Kingambit, but of course with the very little HP that Floette had left, it got eliminated, it fainted. And then I decided to do something. I decided to terrasilize my Torkoal to use some fire type moves against the Kingambit. Of course it almost got one shot by Stone Edge because of a critical hit, but I used Flamethrower to take out the Kingambit. Thankfully it got one shot, otherwise I would be kinda cooked. So I used a Max Potion also to heal the Torkoal against the Avalanche, but then I noticed I didn't really have to do that, as you will see soon, as the Avalanche did basically nothing. So a Flamethrower was enough to one-shot the Avalog, and then it was time for Gogoat, which also got one shot by Flamethrower. Now our last Pokemon, Glimmora, did very little damage to the Bronzong, and of course Gyro Ball does a bit more since it's effective, so a few hits of those was enough to finally beat Jida and therefore become a champion. Now we're on the same level as Nemona, finally. So there you have it, AZ can in fact become Pokemon champion. Now if you haven't already, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, it would really help me out. And goodbye.